Initially, I want to talk about when I first got hired at an agency as a content strategist. And one of my colleagues said to me, he said, "Hey, congratulations. We've had you as a freelancer for months doing this massive inventory project for an energy company and its global web presence. And I had thousands and thousands of lines in this spreadsheet that I'd made by hand. And he said, now we're going to show you the bots that'll do all this for you." And I got really excited. And then I realized that those bots didn't exist, and he was joking, and I was suitably crestfallen. But I was excited because I'd done all of this documentation of all this work and tried to discover all these things about this energy company's presences. And as soon as I had all of that, I went to the design team and I said, "Look at all the stuff we found." And I soon learned that, by and large, designers won't read spreadsheets. Now, there are a lot of great designers out there, and they bring things to the table that certainly I don't bring to the table. They have aesthetic senses that are beyond mine. But when you give them documentation, a lot of the time, they're a little loath to read it. And I said, that's fine, because I'm going to work with all sorts of other people. So I'm going to work with business analysts. I'm going to work with developers. We're going to talk about how we can give them a content model and implement that. And I learned that for every really excellent business analyst or developer or designer, there are other people who didn't want to read any of this documentation I'd created. So the tactics that I'm going to be talking about today are ways that I've tried to sort of get away from creating documentation for documentation's sake and get to the insights that I need faster. So specifically, we're going to talk about web scraping with Python, and we're going to talk about prototyping with live content using some of the output for the first half. So, web scraping. Web scraping is pretty understandable. It's pretty, it's a well-defined thing. It's just automating the process of pulling data from published content on the web. And I think that this is a great technique to bring into your discovery process. And it's really helpful when you deploy it effectively, but you need to know the limits. So automated crawls are great for quantifying things, for counting things, for saying these are the things that exist. But they're not so great at analyzing things. And that's something that I really want to emphasize here. I'm not suggesting that we automate ourselves out of jobs as content professionals. In fact, I think this allows us to spend more of our time doing the analysis that, as content professionals and experts, we are well primed to do. However, automated web crawls and web scraping can also reveal things that you might not be able to find on your own. And that's just because they're going to be more methodical than you ever will be. So they're a great way to find legacy content that might be managed in a separate CMS, and something that stakeholders aren't even aware of right now. More than once, I have created a web scraper, loosed it on a client website when we're trying to do some discovery, and found whole sections of the site that our clients weren't even aware of. And when you present that kind of finding up front, you build this trust immediately. People say, oh, you're going that deep? You're finding these things that we don't even know about? That's why you're in the room. And once you've built that trust, you can have the freedom to do a lot more interesting things down the road. You don't have to prove your value. Now, web crawlers are pretty standard things, and yet the process seems a little obscure sometimes. This New York Times article cracked me up a couple years ago because they had scare quotes around web crawler. It said, Ed Snowden used web crawler software to pull things off the internet, like it's a really scary thing. I was like, well, but that's a pretty basic thing. It's one of the first things you can learn how to do that's actually useful if you're learning how to program. Now, I also want to emphasize, if you're interested in just indexing your site, getting a list of everything that's published, you don't have to roll your own. You don't have to start scripting something or writing any code. You can actually use a lot of off-the-rack tools, and there's a lot of great ones out there. I still have most of these on my machine. Screaming Frog is excellent, the content analysis tool, SiteOrbiter. You'll put in a URL, you'll hit start, and you'll walk away, and you come back, and eventually you've got this big list of things from your site. And it usually has things like titles, URLs, meta tags, a bunch of stuff. And that's totally useful. And it's a great way to bootstrap an inventory or audit process. But it's also a little limited because these off-the-rack tools can only solve for pretty generic use cases. And your use cases probably aren't generic. I mean, everyone's content is going to be unique, and your needs are going to be unique in trying to understand that and analyze that. So you get a lot of extra control if you're willing to say, okay, I'm going to roll my own, I'm going to take something, I'm going to decide the things I want to target, and then I'm going to analyze them. So web crawlers don't have a whole lot of things they have to do. I mean, this is pretty straightforward. First, they've got to load a page, so send an HTTP request and get the response. They have to parse the response they get. Then they've got to capture some things, because if they're not capturing anything, they're not doing you much good if they're just loading everything. And then they've got to repeat. And that's really the concept you need to get your head around if you're thinking, I want to work with writing a script to capture some data from a website. Before I dive into this specific approach, I want to emphasize that this is an approach that's worked for me. You might use a different framework. You would probably have to customize this to get anything useful from your site. But I'm hoping that this can serve as a model for people, so people can say, oh, you know what, I see how this might be useful for my site, or my property, or my organization. So specifically, I want to talk about the Scrapy framework, which is it's a Python framework for writing web crawlers and web scrapers. It's an open source project. It's actively maintained. There's a really great community of people contributing to it and answering questions about Scrapy on Stack Overflow. It's real easy to get help. And it does all the boring stuff for you. So you don't have to think about how to write something that's going to be sending an HTTP request and getting the request. You don't have to think about how am I going to parse pages with it. And you don't have to think about how to repeat. You just need to do what you would do as somebody who, looking at the content that exists at first, would understand. You have to decide what to capture.